It's very interesting how quickly, though, constraints breed innovation. So you saw this, at least in the way that it's reported, that the DeepSeek models were built without relying on the top grade H100s from NVIDIA because of embargoes. So they figure out how to do it on much cheaper compute. And then even on the inference side, figuring out how to run inference with much smaller sections of the model at a time. And instead of having to have this massive model that's maintained the whole time that you're doing inference. And that kind of innovation quickly spreads and actually makes it back out to the people that were doing it the very expensive way.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Epic Web3 podcast. I'm your host, Irena, head of Ecosystem at Chainflip. Today I'm joined by Andrew Hill, CEO of Recall Protocol. Recall allows agents to trade, share, and store intelligent information and intelligent assets, and it could operate and interact with a network of AI agents to improve their knowledge and skills on demand. Recall was built from the ground up let's start again. Recall was built from the learning to machine learning interoperability that allows for scalable and secure network of decentralized AI intelligence. Hi, Andrew. It's great to have you here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Right. So first and most importantly, in your own words, how would you introduce Recall to the potential users and the audience?
Yeah. I think right now it's actually helpful to kind of back up a little bit to set the stage for Recall. Agents are moving really fast, and it's interesting when I give talks, I kind of poll the audience, like who's using agents, who's building agents, who's paying attention to agents, and the numbers are really mixed depending on what audience. And so I find it helpful just generally like backing up. I think there's a couple of things that people don't fully realize if they're not close to the front lines that we're leaning into trends in the world. So two of them that are really important for why Recall and why what we're building, defining what we're building, are one, intelligence is commoditizing incredibly fast. And what I mean by that is if you look at the way at the timeline from going from like GPT-3 to a handful of incredibly powerful foundation models existing in the world, and some of those being open source, it's very clear that intelligence is so valuable, yet it's still software, and software moves very fast. And just the value of it here means that many people are trying to build it. And it doesn't seem to be possible that any single organization right now can contain it and dominate that sort of thread internally. And so we've seen this, right? We've seen, first with really Meta releasing the first version of Llama, and then with DeepSeek really going full open source, and then many other people. And so there's this possible future where some people believe, maybe a lab is going to get to ASI first and really focus on that like AI that has been trained to build AI. Mark Zuckerberg has been on the podcast circuit lately, and he's talked a lot about it. Like their focus for building agents is to build agents that can help them build the next Llama. And one thread of thinking is that one of these labs is going to build that agent. That agent is going to continue to get more intelligence, and they're going to have the kind of omni agent that does everything in the world, or swarm of agents. But that just doesn't seem to match the data so far. The data really, what I was just talking about is that this intelligence proliferates very quickly, and many people build many different models. And even if somebody gets to that agent that can build new models competently, that is going to commoditize. And so you imagine the number of models and the number of agents that are being built right now is only going to go faster. Okay, if that commoditization pattern holds true. Okay, so that's trend number one. Trend number two, and this one's a little bit more hidden, I think, to most, is that every startup in the world right now, sort of, with some caveats, many startups in the world right now are building agentic scaffolding. This is, companies are focused on agents no matter what their size. Big companies are building agents to replace their products. Small companies are doing the same. But also something that I'm seeing happen in other companies and talking to other founders is that many of them are building custom agentic scaffolding And what I mean by that is creating software that wraps the intelligence, sometimes wraps custom models to execute specific tasks. And they're doing that because this intelligence right now is good enough to start moving their company faster. And what's really interesting is many of these companies are trying to build agentic scaffolding to solve tasks that aren't necessarily solved perfectly by the centralized lab companies, right? They're building the scaffolding in order to direct the intelligence to solve a need that they have. And so this is proliferating. Thousands of startups are doing this, and many of the agents that they're building are going to productize, which means that, we're going to have just thousands, perhaps millions of agents with different tastes, goals, aptitudes, and all of those systems are going to be evolving, learning, compounding collectively. So when I follow that thread, those sort of two trends, I believe that in like the 1 to 2 year timeline, we're going to have an insanely capable interconnected intelligence. And so that's a bet we're taking, is that intelligence in the future could look a lot more like the internet and not be a winner take all system. And so if that emerges, and this is what we're really excited about, is that if that emerges, the question is, how do we trust an agent existing anywhere on the internet built by many of companies? And I think a good mental framework to think about this is hiring. So when you hire somebody, you don't just take their word for it. You don't just go like, I have a job opening, somebody said they want it, I'll give it to them because they said they'll be good at it. You test their skills, you check their references, you talk to their past employers and their coworkers. You verify their work history, oftentimes looking at GitHub or their Behance profile or wherever they're showcasing the past work. You do a lot, and this actually is maybe one of the most time-consuming things at small companies. And these are the exact kinds of roles that these companies are building agents to fill. And so how would you do that same level of vetting for agents that are going to do the work that you would have hired people to do before? And I think that's like a good way to think about it. Like, how do we trust agents that are going to do real valuable work in organizations and as individuals? And so that's why we're building Recall. So Recall, we aim to be an open, permissionless evaluation layer for AI. We want to be where agents prove themselves, and we do that through public competition, measured performance, and transparent reputation. And the whole point of it being to unlock this idea that anyone should be able to build agents and build new kinds of intelligence on this network, and anyone should be able to evaluate those agents, and those agents should be able to prove their ability and improve their skills through feedback and the data that we can give back to them through our system. And so I think as that system and as the agents individually become more powerful and as we can build that connectivity between them, then I think the really kind of big question for all of us is, how can we guide this intelligence? How can we guide the individual agents? And so that's the piece that Recall tries to solve through, instead of relying on centralized benchmarks and the closed platforms, we're trying to create this permissionless network for evaluation. Agents competing in the public, the measurements are open and the performance is open, and the alignment of these things is something that they can prove. And this is really important thing. Right now, a lot of organizations are very interested in the alignment of intelligence, but we don't really have any ways to do that verifiably and in the open easily. And so we believe if we can build this trust layer for the Internet of Intelligence, instead of having a handful of organizations ensuring that intelligence is aligned, we can help developers feel confident to build agents that are tested fairly and can be visibly improving and be evaluated according to their alignment, and actually in such a way that the users of the network and the users of the agent can define even what good looks like and what they're being evaluated against. So that's like the mid-length response to what is Recall.
So if I smooth brain it a little bit, if the hypothesis is that we are moving to the commoditization and the future where we're going to have aligned and interconnected Internet of Agents and intelligence, there need to be robust tools for verify the for verify that the agents and the internet is actually working as it should. Recall builds those layers to provide reliable, clear framework for verification of that decentralized and open internet of intelligence.
That was great. Yeah.
Okay. I think, to be really honest, I'm going to start with a more existential question, because obviously right now, when you mentioned that there's openness from the Meta side, obviously on the OpenAI, you have the APIs. I believe you also use OpenAI in Recall as well. But the reality is, how far do you think we are from this point where all those proprietary companies, which also depend on the shareholders, will be willing to actually open up to the openness and start sharing their full original data, because then essentially that would make them not very competitive in the market?
Yeah, there's a lot of different takes on that. Even Sam Altman has kind of addressed that in a couple of different ways. One, they've already moved to opening some of their models, and two, he's really pointed out a couple of things that are not the model per se that will be their competitive advantage. One being broadly the application itself and the lock-in around building the app, not the model. And then a piece of that being really highlighted in the last month is the memory. So you pointed out data, but this specific data, the data that we upload to these models, being a bit of their lock-in. So if you want that kind of individual tailoring of the model's responses to everything about you, you just upload more and more data to the thing. And that's the application. That's the lock-in they have. But the model itself, I think it's going to be really tricky for that to be the differentiator. We're seeing a broad set of models all kind of competing towards relatively similar or leapfrogging capabilities. And all the major labs are focused on kind of some of the high value tasks of like, how do you get these models to write effective software or do research on AI and build their own models and things like that. So there's this kind of like homogenous model building happening in these things, and there might not be, or in these organizations, and there might not be that much value in the model itself as a differentiator and as a lock-in. So I think that just plays into the commoditization story pretty heavily. And we're going to see, like I said, a lot of organizations figuring out how to solve the long tail of tasks, the things that those foundation model builders are not focused on right now. And we see that even in our ecosystem, right? Like the number of teams that are trying to build trading agents, but it's pretty clear, like they're not training the foundation models to know anything outside of like scraping crypto news sites. These foundation models don't really know anything about crypto networks per se. And so you see all these teams building their own agentic scaffolding to give them that knowledge and the resources and the tools to do specific tasks on the long tail. And yeah, I think we're just going to see that go further and further. And the lock-in for the model around a specific model is not going to be that great. And so I think there's going to only be more and more opening of models.
And it's also interesting because then you can argue, once those models are in the wild, it's up to the individual who's building those skill set, whether they'll be able to actually build something competitive or not, because they're well, not lazy, but have different resource constraints. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that's like a super cool insight too, because what you see is like training one of these large foundation models, it's cost, it's cost of hardware, it's the amount of data, it's the training time, it's the researchers. Once you have one of these models, it's obviously costly to maintain the infrastructure to run that model for inference. But something that we know is very effective is using these models to train lighter weight specific models to solve specific tasks. Again, this is like further evidence towards the proliferation and the commoditization of models. Is like we're going to see models that are actually fine-tuned and trained on crypto-specific regimes of data and crypto domains. And we're going to see a lot of these probably built by networks themselves, so that they'll have specific models that are very good for putting into an agent that does things on Solana, things like that. That's all going to get easier as frameworks and tooling comes along and just proliferate intelligence.
Which is also very interesting because there's always argument right now that all the data is available on chain, but the reality is that even at this point, there's so much, and you have a lot of examples of the tooling which help you to search and trace specific data. But the reality is, with specific products, it's very still unclear how to actually quantify the data, and it takes a while for now yet to actually discover the original raw data, which actually going to give you allow you to make certain decisions, even from business wise, because a lot of those the value of the data is always going to be to drive other businesses and their revenue model.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think like you could take a number of pretty nice little like toy examples and see, the difficulty of this being centralized. And I don't mean like in the Web3 versus Web2. I just mean like a single company solving all of it. But, you know, I've built a number of like hobby agents to just test frameworks and see how the different models perform. Take like the example of the crypto trading agents. If I build an agent that does something like look at Twitter to try to figure out what people are talking about. Now, if I go to Twitter, I've been in crypto long enough or just have had enough exposure to these things. I can look at a tweet and pretty quickly identify if it's some kind of pump, some kind of scam behind the information. And sometimes, there's a gradient there, and it gives me enough to be like, oh, I should look one level deeper and then figure something out about it. But none of these models can do that. They don't quite have the sensibility or all that experience, or they can't quite read the cues, so they just don't know it. But it's not actually that hard of a problem once you can figure out how to kind of guide the model the right way and then give it the tools for the follow-on research. And those things will be solved very well, especially with people working on wallet-based agents and trading agents and all those things. So that specificity is like a really good example of just where like we're going to be so much better armed as like networks of individuals building these things and figuring out that source data and figuring out how you feed it into a model and how you constrain the agent and you point it in the right direction to do the right things.
And also, I mean, the example that you've given is actually pattern recognition, and the pattern recognition is built through experience, and the experience for any agent is going to be limited by the resources that you have to cover the cost of generating the data over a certain period of time. And then it opens up. And actually, I wanted to ask you another question before we go to the blockchain and how we can actually proliferate the sharing and learning together and how we can leverage the blockchain. But actually, you mentioned something and I really wanted to ask you. So when you start talking about commoditization, there is a very interesting example which we see with chips, which are very crucial for the infrastructure for building and training models. And it's all about the power of compute. And right now, commodities actually play a very important role, specifically rare earths. And notoriously, 70% of them are owned by Chinese right now. So that creates a very long-term risk and bottleneck for non-Chinese companies sourcing the resources to actually proliferate the development of the chip production. So the question is, do you think there is also actually the risk that there's still going to be stronger control for the infrastructure producers before we actually will be able to move to more decentralized and shared framework for building better and stronger agents on top of other agents?
Sorry, so the question is if the kind of controlled supply chain of the very
Yes.
compute infrastructure that we rely on is
Is
going
that
to
true?
limit our ability to proliferate or spread these things?
Yes.
Yeah. That's a super interesting question. It's very interesting how quickly, though, constraints breed innovation. So you saw this, at least in the way that it's reported, that the DeepSeek models were built without relying on the top grade H100s from NVIDIA because of embargoes. So they figure out how to do it on much cheaper compute. And then even on the inference side, figuring out how to run inference with much smaller sections of the model at a time. And instead of having to have this massive model that's maintained the whole time that you're doing inference. And that kind of innovation quickly spreads and actually makes it back out to the people that were doing it the very expensive way. And I think we just see more and more cases of that. And so okay, so how do we get to cheaper models? I think that's one path, is this like innovation that's happening to actually go from, these like very expensive Model Ts to kind of the Honda Civics of models. I don't know what that path is. I don't know what the analogy is, but you probably see what I'm saying. The early models being very expensive and then figuring out how to make them cheaper to build and cheaper to maintain is already happening. Another thing is there are a lot of reasons to build models that can run on a lot cheaper infrastructure, and those are driven by demand. So we saw this with Apple's release of intelligence on the device. So you get kind of this split use of resources where it will run entirely on your phone when it can, or it pushes off to the cloud and runs privately or securely for you there. But obviously it's cheaper for the provider, the more and more it can push to the device. The more and more it just uses my battery and isn't going over bandwidth and isn't going to their data centers, it becomes closer to free for them to run. So the more they can invest in making those models smaller and lightweight, the better. So that's one path. Then there's just the path of so many tinkerers right now. You can find a number of models that are being built for running on Raspberry Pi right now. And those models are going to get better and better, in my view, both by figuring out how we can make bigger models run on smaller infrastructure, but also how we can train smaller models to do better specific things. And then how we can create sort of like chimeras or like composites from different models that can be picked up and selected to do things as you need them. I think all of these things are just pushing us like beyond those constraints, and it's coming. Like the flood of models is coming. And if you look at any of the model marketplaces or model aggregators, the numbers are wild. And many of these models, they work in conjunction with more traditional modeling and statistics too. And so there's all that as well to just solve things with the right tool. It doesn't always take a large language model. It takes the decision thinking to then pump information to the right models. But it's just proliferating so quick. And look at Hugging Face, look at Open Gradient, look at any of these places where you can find models, and they're just increasing every day.
All right. So then would it be rightfully to say now that we actually will talk a little bit about the design choices that you guys made, that choosing to build in a decentralized way, leveraging blockchain infrastructure was also an intuitive way for you guys to solve for certain restrictions?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a bunch of reasons why decentralization just matters for us. I mean, I like to think of what we're building as kind of agnostic to the technology it runs on. Like, I don't think that developers of agents and of intelligence necessarily need to think of decentralized or not, or have a camp. But what we're building leverages decentralization for some very important reasons that you just get the best of from building decentralized protocols. And the first one is gatekeeping. Like, it doesn't make sense to us to build the evaluation and the guardrails and the trust for intelligence in a way that some centralized organization has a singular board of directors or a singular CEO that just makes the final decision on what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong. I think this sort of for our vision, we need to build a protocol that can be interacted with and run by many different people with many different viewpoints, and all of them be able to access it. So for us, like, the internet is the model, right? And so that's kind of like point two is global access. Like, if the internet is the model for what we're trying to build, it's really important that there's no regional or institutional lock-in to what we're doing. We really need intelligence that anybody can access. And I actually just to pause on there to double click on that like internet analogy. The reason that analogy is like so present in our minds is like we really think this agentic scaffolding and the internet like intelligence is actually going to transform the internet as we know it. And so being able to grow lockstep with the internet is going to be important. And then, incentives and alignment at the protocol level is something that's like very tightly bound in decentralized protocols, where you can engineer the incentives, set them loose. Anybody can see them. Anybody can see how they work. Anybody can see how people are earning or being penalized. Earning is transparent, and nobody really controls that in a centralized way. And then maybe the most important for right now is the verifiable results. So like right now we have live competitions for trading agents in crypto. So these are agents that are making real-time 24/7 decisions about whatever crypto alpha they can detect, making trading decisions to try to maximize the profit on their portfolio. And this is a very broad use case, and we could talk about that, how that goes later. But the reason that's like stop number one for our system is that there's just so much FUD around it in our ecosystem. There's so many teams trying to build trading. We're not really sure who's performing. We're not really sure emerging teams are capable of performing or what their claims are. It's not so easy to look at what an agent tells you it's doing and know that's true. And so what we do with the competition is we create a controlled environment where no agent that's competing knows what's going to happen. It's using real-time market information, and they're submitting real-time trading decisions that are all then back tested after the competition is over to look at what their portfolio value will be. And all of that needs to be verifiable, because the purpose of it is to build trust around the great agents that are doing it well. And even the agents that are not doing it well, build trust for them, because they can come back and do it again and again until they get better and can perform consistently with the best. And so giving them a path to improve their agent and build, that reputation and the trust of their community. So verifiable, open, tamper-proof are all things that blockchain tends to be very good at. So that's why the backshop things of recall really need to be on a protocol like that.
And it's very interesting because I think it's probably over 2 years ago when they were interviewing Lanier in terms of what would be the use case opportunities for Bitcoin, and provenance and verification was one of the easiest use cases, which has always been on the surface. But it's also interesting how you guys also use incentive model, because I think for a very long time, creator economy was the place where they tried to implement those models, as well as also with social graph and how those incentives are redistributed fairly. But it's very interesting to see that when it comes through for building agents and training agents and verifying and incentivize them to perform, this is where it really all the puzzles come together. And I think on that note, I would be very happy to kind of talk about the competitions and how you come about it, and just in general. Yes, so you have a mental model which helps to guide how those competitions are held, but I was wondering why you decided that's going to be kind of the most efficient way to find who's best, or is it just based on a kind of general competitiveness of the builders?
Yeah. The answer to that is definitely multifaceted, and something that I talk to people outside of the organization and team members about all the time. So there's kind of like, a roadmap or a ladder of product pieces that we'll build. But the reason we start with competition has a few different really important reasons. It's very easy. Well, so one is the ecosystem that we're building into. So being in blockchain, it's very clear that there's this use case that a lot of teams are putting a lot of resources into building, yet there's a lot of uncertainty around it. And our whole purpose is to build trust in an ecosystem and build trust for agents. And so these agents actually, we think, need help. Like, they need help to be able to showcase what they're good at and let them thrive. So one is the market, and just kind of listening to what the needs are is sort of the model for that competition is very straightforward, right? Like I kind of mentioned before, they're going through real-time analysis and making decisions in the market. And then we just backtest those decisions to calculate what the P&L would be. They're not doing real trading. They're doing paper trading with submissions, signed submissions for what their trades would be. And so we just backtest those and calculate the P&L. But you can see that has just like an objective, verifiable outcome. Anybody could verify it by looking at those timestamps, looking at the market data. So we don't need like human scoring. There's no model evals yet that we have to run there. And performance can just be measured and public and even real time. So that's another piece of it, is this kind of performance aspect of it. So we have a really big community that's super excited about this. It's like a really fun area to imagine how do I identify the best traders and then how do I use them. And so being able to channel that audience has been really, really fun. And like we had like community voting for this first competition to pick the ones that based on the strategies and their avatars and stuff, just which ones did they like and how did they want to engage. And I think the top one got over like 100,000 people engaging with that agent, and now that agent is actually showing consistent profits in the trading competition. I think it's in the lead right now and kind of crushing its competitors, and so that's super exciting. So hopefully we can help them build a bigger audience themselves. And so that's another big piece of it, kind of tying them all together. But I think it's worth noting too, like if you look at it right now, it's kind of like a broad P&L competition. Our vision for that is probably that skill doesn't exist on our network in about a year. It's a really good starting point because we have a huge funnel of agents that are doing it in a lot of different ways. And so we start with this kind of broad competition, but over time, it's not a very useful skill to just measure broadly, right? Like as all these agents are doing different things, it will likely bifurcate, right? Right now, it's a 7-day trading window that we're evaluating, which tells you some information about what that agent's good at. But you might imagine we split that and there's a 7-day and there's like a, best intraday trader, or you might have a competition where an agent has to detect the single best trade to make in 24 hours, those sorts of things. You might have perpetual trading or cross exchange, arbitrage. You might have DeFi native trading, and each of those being a specific skill that different pools and some overlapping pools of agents are competing to get the best score on that skill. And then if we can prove that out and build trust across many skills, then you come back to the raw P&L score and you have more of like orchestrating or Uber agents that can either do it all or can actually contract other agents to do specific things and make evaluations about what to do when to just be profitable across all strategies. But yeah, each of these becomes a skill. Right now we have this one P&L skill, and like these niches will emerge and people will compete and specialize.
Would you right now define your audience as more kind of crypto native builders and participants?
Yeah, I think right now we're really focused on this track of competitions, and so right now playing with some of the constraints around these competitions to tease out some of this specialization. So we have the next competition coming up. Agents will have to actually pick their strategy, and either be a Solana focused strategy or an Ethereum focused strategy, and then pitting those against each other. And then we have partnerships with other organizations in crypto that have their own agent ecosystems, but don't have these kind of trust and performance skills. And so we'll be partnering with them to give them performance skills through competition going forward. But so yeah, it's very crypto focused right now. Though every time I go to a crypto conference, I think to myself, wow, I can't wait to go to more like Web2 agent builder conferences, because I think a lot of what we're saying is much more novel and interesting to folks. And like in crypto, I think a lot of what we're saying maybe sounds similar to things that they've heard in crypto a long time, like earning by participating and things like that. But yeah, I'm excited to break out of Web3 in the near future.
It sometimes does feel like we kind of quite often exist in an echo chamber, and because there has been a lot of innovation coming outside of crypto but within the AI, and it's always, I think it is very challenging to try to combine both. And to be honest, I'm very excited to see the use cases where somebody is using blockchain based product AI but don't realize it. And the thing is, even the way Recall designed from a user perspective who engages with your website, it doesn't really tell much about blockchain. It just basically tells you a story and what's the purpose of it. And it's also kind of, very engaging because there's a competition. But in terms of how you set up, I was very curious because right now it's very easy. You work with quantitative data, but also with some of the use cases that you have, like personal agents and looking at scientific research. Do you guys see that how easy it is to create and train agents, and are there incremental risk when you have more qualitative data to work with?
So the question is like, how are we going to evaluate these skills that don't have, an oracle or a price feed?
Yes. And what do you think there's more risks with getting it correct or having agents actually misbehave, let's put it that way?
Yeah, I think it's like a really insightful question. There's kind of two pieces in there, which is like how do we evaluate, and then how do we detect misbehavior? Well, the one on the one side, like how do we break out of the oracles and the price feeds and the the objective outcomes? I think there's a lot of exciting ways to do that. One is like how do we break down complex tasks into specific skills? So for example, you might evaluate an agent's ability to do research first on asking how well it synthesizes its paper to answer specific questions. And so if you have a time-bounded competition where they don't know what paper they'll have to synthesize, and you know the answers to some questions, you can basically send that out to the competing agents, get their results, and evaluate the results against known answers or expected answers. So those sorts of flows will be common. The other one that I'm excited to explore, we don't have concrete plans around it, is much more community-based scoring. And so this already happens training AI models. It just doesn't happen necessarily on a decentralized network, though I think there's probably decentralized networks that are doing only this. But like in AI training called human in the loop. And so in this case, you might have like community participation to score outputs. So instead of relying only on automated metrics, you might like gather structured feedback from users or evaluators. And there are some cool ways that this breaks out. Like you might have a set of experts do it on a limited set of answers and then evaluate and not tell the competitors which set of answers have no, or which set of questions have known answers, and then just compare that subset against the experts. So that takes a less amount of time. Or you might have a limited set of sort of generalist participants evaluating anonymously a set of scores, a limited set of scores across thousands of agents, and then pulling that together to look at what are the ranked scores for specific things. And I think there'll be a lot of hybrids where you have, reputation systems, human in the loop systems, and like actual evaluation of results. But there's just so many building blocks to do this, and especially on a decentralized network where we can get like very close interactions and engagement from users to look at results from agents. I think there's just so many building blocks we get to put together.
Amazing. And then I think just to get back to the second question, and just in general, it's one of the biggest concerns in terms of not necessarily protecting those who are going to be interacting with agents, but how I don't want to say control because we talk about decentralization and actual democratization of the data, but do you think the control is needed, and how those constraints should be implemented?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, every time I think of like a big risk in AI, I wonder who in crypto is working on that. And so that it is like, it is important. It is super important. But like with agents, let's see, setting aside some of the like trust of the model specifically, like the alignment, and more like trusting that the model is what it says it is, and that the agent competing is the same one that, say, you're later contracting to do something for you. I think there's just this like whole spectrum of trust vectors that are going to come into play. Right now, we're really focused on evaluating performance, and soon like evaluating like proximity to different aligned goals. But like questions like who built the agent, what code is running, where it's running, the whole supply chain. And I think those are all going to be really important. And so if you have a performance score plus you have an agent that is running on a TEE, you get a lot more kind of freedom in your ability to choose that agent if it's what you want. And so I think we're going to see this. We're going to see this often, where even if there's a leader on the leaderboard, it may not be the one you choose to solve that skill for you, because you're going to be looking for these other parameters to the agent, whether that's like team KYC or eval certifications or running on a TEE or ZK proofs of the software supply chain. And we're not really focused on building those additional parameters of the agent. We're actually trying to partner with other organizations that are building specifically those things. So agents running agents and models running on TEE. There are a number of projects building those solutions. Like, so I mentioned already Open Gradient, for example, they have models that are on TEE. I've been talking to Terminal 3 as another project, and they have some support for TEE where you could have potentially TEE certifications. An agent has to pass even in the timeline of your request to that agent off of our network. The agent might say, I passed this certification. That's broadly a good example. Eval is like, I'll never try to kill somebody, but like in crypto, it might be, I'll never consider making a trade for the user that will benefit me more than the user. And so you might have an eval like that runs on a TEE, so the agent can get certified against that eval and then actually get certified in the runtime of your prompt to the agent. Those sorts of things could be possible through partners and ZK proofs of the software. So like an agent that is leading our leaderboard, you want to know what is the software behind that agent, and ZK proofs can, are emerging that can show you exactly that version that's running there is the same version that is responding to you when you prompt it in your system. And so those sorts of things are being built by other people. And so we're aiming to partner with them to do that. And then we get to really focus on this performance layer and the trust and trying to bring it all together. Like what can agents do and what are they proving about themselves on these other solutions and make it all verifiable.
Perfect. Yes, it's which also helps you guys to keep focus on the
gotta focus.
You gotta focus here. It has to be the trusted layer for verification of the agents.
Yeah.
Of the Internet of Intelligence. I'm taking this term with me from today's conversation.
Perfect. Yeah.
We are running out of time. I have two last questions. One, obviously, what is next coming for Recall? You mentioned more competitions. What else to expect?
I mean, it's all about competitions right now publicly. Like I said, the P&L competition starts to bifurcate pretty quickly. We have a number of partnerships lined up to have specific competitions around specific other tools and ecosystems. So that will be really exciting. But really, the competition framework that we're building is far less valuable as a one-off. And it's far more valuable if we can consistently run competitions that are testing the same skill. Because when you want to build trust in an agent, you really want to see that performance be consistently good over time. And if you're building an agent that isn't consistently good, you want to, as the agent builder, want to consistently see it get better so that you know that you can eventually go out to market with that agent. And so building those recurring competitions is like our total focus right now, and building the applications around that. And we have a lot of people in the community that ask, like, are competitions like the Trojan for something else you want? And no, like they're always like quite like pleasantly surprised, I think, when we say no. Competitions are the thing right now. They're the product. Like, this is how we help agents show up and emerge as trusted and showcase their performance. And right now, competitions are subsidized. So we're actually rewarding agents that are competing and winning. But I just had a Twitter space this morning, actually, with the team that's currently top of our leaderboard for the P&L. And they said the same thing that we hypothesized, which is they don't care so much about the winnings. I mean, it's a nice bonus, but they care about being able to show and showcase and in a verifiable way the performance of their agents and get an audience for that. And so really just doing that again and again and again and getting more and more agents to get scored and reduce the FUD and build some quality agents in the ecosystem.
That's amazing. I might sneak in one last existential question, but
Sneak in an existential question. Okay.
In a broader scheme of AI, there's always a debate whether the agents and other tooling and robotics are going to actually take away jobs from people or they're going to help them to perform better. There's tons of debate about it, so I'll be very keen to hear your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I have a mixed answer, right? I think it's obvious that AI right now is already taking away some jobs. Like, you just kind of have to acknowledge that there are a number of jobs that people are not going to hire for anymore. I think I put a lot of hope in people's ability to sidestep that and harness AI to create new jobs. And I know that's easier said than done. So just kind of being sensitive to the people that are already losing their jobs. I think that there's a pretty strong case to be made here that AI actually creates a lot more work in the near future versus reducing it. The question is whether the skills of the people that are losing their jobs are going to translate very well to the new work that is being created. That's the real question. So, and I don't know the answer to that, but at least for some sectors, like this is something I told my engineers a few weeks ago in kind of like I didn't mean it to be as blunt as maybe it came across, but the way I said it, and I don't love this analogy, but it was the best I could come up with on the spot, was that we're going through another industrial revolution. But this time you are the horse. And that's the problem we're in right now. But I said the opportunity is that unlike a horse, you can figure out how to drive the train. And if you don't figure out how to drive the train, it's going to be bad in the near future. But if you figure out how to drive the train, the opportunities are going to be massive. And so figuring out how to harness AI to do more in your work. So that's like a bit of a mixed answer. I do wonder a lot on that concept of AI creating more work. And this relates to chips and compute and a lot of things in AI. People have referenced it a few times that I've heard. There's a concept, I think it's called Jevons paradox. And so I've heard it in reference to compute, which is basically the paradox is that the cheaper and more abundant compute gets, it doesn't lessen the demand for each unit. It actually increases total demand. And we see that. And I think the case example of that is like road networks. You build a bigger road and you actually get more traffic than reducing traffic. That's the classic example. And I actually wonder if that same paradox will be applied here to work. So suddenly we have agents that can do a ton more work a lot cheaper. And does it actually reduce the demand on the people, or does it actually increase the demand on the people because suddenly we can build a lot more things a lot faster? And I tend to believe in the latter. But yeah, the real problem is whether the people that are losing jobs already today can translate skills to where the future is going, and what that really is going to look like. I'm not sure.
And you're always going to have the Luddites of this modern century who is just going to be trying to break everything and but hey, it's kind of too late to stop at this point, I think.
It is too late to stop, but best we can do is try to align it.
Right. Thank you very much. Obviously, at the end of our conversation, what are the best ways to follow you guys, participate in the competitions, and learn more?
Yeah, just jump on Twitter, RecallNet, or hop into our Discord. I think, we'd love to have any agent builders that think their agents can trade. There's no cost to entry, and we don't make you real trade during the competition window. So it's a pretty low risk way to try to showcase what you're capable of. And follow us on YouTube. I've been a little bit slow there, but my personal Twitter handle is DevRel Intern. And so I've been trying to moonlight as a DevRel to show people how to build agents and how to use some of our tools. So if you're interested in getting your hands dirty, you can check out some of those videos. But yeah, we'd love to have you building agents with us.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thank you very much for your time. It was a great pleasure having you.
Yeah, thank you so much.